presented exclusively by Mother's Polish.
Welcome back to another edition of the Slipstream Podcast, where we're delivering weekly Formula One content to you, the F1 fan. In this week's episode, we're going to stick to the roundtable format from episode 3, but focus on some Formula One 101 topics, like regulations and the impact of those regulations on the 2022 season so far. Before we get started, I don't know about you guys, but I woke up Saturday and was legitimately disappointed that there was no F1 qualifying. So needless to say, I understand why the drivers are on a break, but I'm so ready to get back to racing and following all the coverage coming up in Spa in 2 weeks. But I digress. Let's just go ahead and jump right in. And to start off, we'll keep things simple. So Stin, at a high level, what are F1 or FIA regulations, and why do they matter in the sport of F1?
So it's tough to say that I'm going to keep it simple because I never do, but I'll try. So the regulations were brought in just to really confine and define what the teams can and can't do. So originally it was just an open forum and open platform. And as teams excelled, as vehicles got faster, the FIA stepped in to slow the cars down, to make them safer. Unlike a NASCAR or an Indy here in the States, those are spec cars. The spec cars have defined components that you can get from certain manufacturers. The only customization you're doing, really, other than the stickers you put on the vehicle, is like how the suspension feels. What are you doing with maybe tire pressure, camber, kind of how the car is truly set up. When in Formula One, the teams actually make their vehicles. So it's a way for them to restrict and police what's being put on a vehicle. Is it allowed? If they deem it illegal, they will change the regulations for future years to make it more entertaining, more racing, a little bit tighter.
And I know leading into this year, there's a lot of interest and excitement, curiosity, whatever you want to call it, around the specific changes that they were making to this new model, this new generation of car. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe these regulations were actually supposed to debut in 2021, but that got moved back a year due to COVID to give everyone enough time to, basically be ready, because it is quite the overhaul in terms of just what the vehicle actually looks like and the performance of the vehicle. So let's talk why. Why would Formula One decide to overhaul the technical regulations for the 2022 season? I think I have a couple of thoughts and happy to go around the room here. But at least in the couple of years that I've been following Formula One, historically the field seems to have been pretty spread out throughout a race. Cars, this modern generation of vehicles is pretty wide. I don't know, what is it, 2 meters wide almost? So you have a narrow track, wide vehicle. In general, overtaking is difficult. And so I think the overall intent, I'm sure there's many reasons, but as the fan, I think the overhaul of the 2022 car and the new spec model was designed to drive and generate closer racing or more wheel-to-wheel action, the ability to follow more closely, which ultimately leads to more overtakes. And for us, the fans, the idea here is to obviously improve the overall quality of the viewing product. The reality is the closer the racing and more overtakes, that's what we all want to see, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the regulations for this year, to your point, were about bringing the cars closer together. Historically, over the last handful of years, 15 years or so, a lot of the vehicles generated most of their downforce, right, to give them better traction. The most impressive thing about a Formula One vehicle isn't its top speed, it's its cornering speed and how much momentum, how much G's they can pull through each turn. That's really what separates them from everything else. But a lot of that downforce was generated by stuff that was happening on top of the vehicle. And as the vehicle is driving through the air, it's punching a hole and it's disrupting all of those different molecules, and it's making like vortices and random things that come off the vehicle. The more downforce it has, the more they call it dirty air. Like the more the air is disrupted to the from the car in the front. So the car that comes behind, they would say back, in the last regulation last year and years prior, as you approached within about a quarter second, half a second, you're losing 80% of your effective downforce because the air has so much turbulence. So if you're ever driving down the interstate and you pull up behind a semi, you get into that semi's slipstream, right? Their draft, their slipstream, and you can let off the throttle because they're doing most of the work pushing through the air. So this year they really focused on removing all of those intricate, airplane looking parts that were sitting on top of the vehicle, the barge boards, all of the things kind of between the wing and next to the wing, the side body. And this year is about the side skirts and making a suction underneath the vehicle. So using the side of the vehicle and the side skirts to literally create a high force of pressure, hit a negative, and then a lower force or a lower section of pressure, which is like a Venturi tunnel, which literally imagine sucking the car to the ground. And I think that early in the process, they were doing it so effectively that the car was bouncing off of the asphalt, which, Brady, you learned that term.
Porpoising, baby.
What the heck is porpoising? Yeah, so it's literally like the vehicle is driving and bouncing up out of the water or off the asphalt. It's creating such a suction to pull it down that the air is hitting a negative pressure and stalling, and it's completely stopping for that couple of milliseconds, bouncing back up, and then re-engaging. And it was really interesting how they kind of navigated that over the first 5, 6, 7 weeks. Really, testing was super interesting.
Yeah, I thought about this recently. We were at the lake and I was riding a jet ski and I kept bouncing along the water. I was like, I wonder if this is what Lewis and George and all these guys felt like, because it basically was like porpoising. It's the same thing. You're kind of gradually lifting up, in this case, off the water versus off the asphalt. Um, but yeah, it was. I don't think porpoising was new in Formula One. I think they've dealt with it before, but it definitely seemed to be. I don't know if you want to call it an unintended consequence of the regulations, but definitely something that probably was exacerbated that caught a lot of people by surprise, because until they got to where Bahrain, they didn't really know. I mean, a wind tunnel may not be able to show something like that because the environment's different.
Well, they can't run the cars at full speed in a wind tunnel. You can only simulate 60, 70% speed, and they weren't really reaching it until about 180 miles, close to 300, 310 kilometers. And also the track surface matters a lot. If it's a really smooth track, a legacy track that has defined raceway, then great. But as soon as you get to those street tracks that are driving up and down, Baku, or through Monaco. I know Monaco is not high speed, but you can see the vehicles bouncing because the asphalt isn't pristine. It's not repaved frequently because it's always used.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in terms of this year's car, I mean, it just looks more modern for one. I found it interesting, trying to satisfy my craving for Formula One content on social media the last couple of weeks. There's a lot of highlights from the last couple of years, specifically with Mercedes, and they talked about how I think it was the 2020 or 2021 car may be the greatest Formula One car that was ever built. But when you look at it, it's 2 years old and it looks old. I mean, it looks almost like it's from the early 2000s. It just, at least that's what this leap in this new generation, from my view, just makes it look old and outdated. And yeah, especially the wheels. The wheels look like tiny little, in the more recent vehicles, they look like tiny little go-kart wheels, where now they're much bigger, and it just makes it look so different. Yeah, they're bigger, but how much bigger are they, Austin?
I think they went from 13-inch to 18-inch specifically to mirror what production vehicles look like on a road, because you're not going to buy a 13-inch wheel. But a 13-inch wheel, Cole, you know this, is lighter weight. The less weight you have on the rotating axle, the you'll gain extreme performance. You also had a lot of sidewall in the car, so you could use a lot of that bouncing to be absorbed in the tire and in the sidewall, where this year you're dealing with low profile tires which don't have as much give, and you have to put the give in the suspension.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And they also have the wheel flare. Is that the right terminology around the front wheels? I'm
The
not
one that
sure if
goes
that's
above the wheel?
yeah, it looks like the little eyebrow, the wheel brow.
Yeah, it's to help cut the air before it reaches the body to limit the disruption off the aerodynamics from the vehicle.
Yeah, so it looks interesting. I know that's conceptually is all designed to create that different outwash of the airflow. So we'll get into it. I know Matt has some data to back this up, but before we sort of dig into the data deep dive on this, just general opinion, and Cole, we can start with you. Do you think the regulations have worked as intended as a fan? Are we seeing better racing, closer racing?
I don't. I would say yes, but I'm not sure if I fully believe that that's what's happening. I'll be curious to know what all the stats say, but it still seems like we have teams that are clear-cut runners and teams who are at the bottom, and it seems like those teams haven't changed a lot, but they have changed. So I'm very curious to hear what all the stats say about overtakes over the past couple years.
Stin, do you have any general opinions? Just you as a fan watching the race? Better, same, worse?
I mean, Max is still doing great, so I'm enjoying it. Um, no, I think I do think you still have the front runners, but I know that the regulations have made it so the front running teams won't have as much time to develop their vehicle. They're all on standard budgets. You will start seeing, and it might not be this year or next year, but as teams are only getting 70% development time and other teams are getting 130%, you will start seeing those gaps be narrowed. And all of a sudden, you might have a complete flip. Like a Williams or a Haas might find something because they have enough time to test it. And the other teams might have burned their budget to try to keep up, and they won't be able to make it.
You just brought up the cost and the spending, and with the cost cap is where they're at, where there is at. Is there a cost floor? Are teams forced to spend an amount of money? Like in the NBA, there is a cost floor where they have to spend 90% of the salary cap on their players, and then if they don't spend that 90%, then they're essentially forced to give that difference back to the players. They have to pay that amount essentially to try to not allow cheap owners to not fund the team and to at least give a better product. Is there an amount that they have to spend? Because if there's an owner in there that's like got a bunch of different investments and opportunities and whatever he's doing, this may not be what he wants to put his money in, which then could also increase or decrease that top team to bottom team, in the rankings over time.
Yeah, the other sport analogy is a fascinating one. Matt, to your point, the NBA has a salary floor, but like Major League Baseball doesn't. So, for example, I think it's the Cleveland Guardians. Their entire team's salary for this season is roughly, I think it's like $40 or $41 million. That's the whole team. And then you got a guy, Max Scherzer, who's making that much money by himself. So clearly, just from a financial perspective, a team like the Cleveland Guardians seems like they have no chance to compete. Now, we've seen crazier things happen in sports. That's what makes sports amazing. But would be curious to know, does F1 have a salary floor in these new regulations, or a cost floor?
I think they look at how much they're spending so much. I don't think any team is going to roll in there with less than 100, 120. I think 140 or it's 140, 145. I think they upped it a little bit. Is kind of what the smaller teams were spending when you look historically that like the Mercedes and the Red Bulls and the Ferraris were spending upwards of 300 to 450, like 300 million is double the budget now, and Mercedes was spending three times that at 450. So, um, great question. I wish I had the answer.
Yeah, so just back on the 2022 changes, I think if these are good points around the cost cap plus the new modern vehicle and what they're trying to do there. I think the overall point of both of those together is to level the playing field to some degree. Also, you make a great point about Mercedes. If Mercedes can spend $500 million, they're probably going to have the best car, especially if no one else maybe they can. Maybe someone like Lawrence Stroll can afford to do that, but he's just not going to do that because he's also going to run it like a business to make a profit. So the intent there between having a cost cap, reallocation of resources, who gets time in the wind tunnel and other things like that, plus the modernization of the rules is overall designed to level that playing field. And Matt, before I jump to you with your thoughts and some data here, my thought is, I don't know. My biggest appreciation for the regulation so far this year is I'm really enjoying trying to see teams figure it out. I think generally from race to race, they definitely can follow closer. I think Crofty says that about 1,000 times, per race. That part is nice. But have we had more exciting races because of it so far? That's where I don't know. I use Hungary, which is the most recent race, as an example of it felt like last year all over again, in the sense you've got Max, Lewis, 1-2. Everyone through P7 was lapped. The field was incredibly spread out. So in that sense, at least if we're using Hungary as an example, I don't know if we saw better or more interesting racing as a fan. I think ultimately we'll get there as people continue to better understand the regulations. People will ultimately maybe, kind of go towards a specific thing that works. But so I don't know. I think maybe I was hoping for a little bit more so far, but it's early. It's 13 races in. So Matt, what do you think?
I think from a eye test, I think the cars are definitely closer. I think that we're getting at least a little bit more exciting race, and I don't know how much of that is the regulations versus production quality over time. The data shows that for this year versus the last 25 years, there is on average on the 12 courses that have historical data, there's 11 more overtakes this year than there was in the past 25 years, which is a lot. Comparing 2021 to 2022, there's about 4.5 overtakes more on these 12 tracks, which is about 14% more, which I do think that's a decent amount. I also think that the tracks that have had more overtakes aren't really out of the norm for the last 10 to 15 years for them outside of Hungary, which you mentioned. Hungary this year had 65 overtakes versus 20 over the last 25 years on average. Going into math and numbers, if you want to talk about standard deviation and all that, there was only 3 out of the 12 tracks that were outside of a normal kind of race, and Hungary being the one that was by far, that was the second most overtakes in a race in Hungary as far back as the data went that we were able to get, which was 1981, 82. And Austria and Baku were the other 2 that were kind of outside of the normal, and Austria was the 3rd highest in the last 7 years. So they had 69 overtakes. So I think the data is showing that there is a slight uptick, but I think it's more exciting if you look at it based from a production standpoint. Like, I think we feel it's more exciting. A lot of that has to do with Ferrari can't stay on the track, or they can't do anything correctly from a strategy standpoint. And so there's a lot of this. Yes. There's a lot of change at the front because of that, and 2 really good drivers and a very good car aren't competing the way they should. So it causes for a lot of drama. But I mean, if you look at the data from this standpoint, from a production quality, this year, 55% of the overtakes have been on TV. If you look at 10 years ago, it was 40%, and if you look at 20 years ago, it was 28%. So we're seeing more of them happen because of we have drones that can follow the cars. There's more cameras on the track. It allows for the viewer to see more than what's going on, so it makes you feel like it's happening more often. We see that in media all the time, right? Things that you might see on the media 20 times, but it happens 2% of the time. It gives a feel to the human nature that it's happening more, which it is, but I feel like there's more of a drastic because of what they're showing. the production on the TV, where it's a hard thing to produce a 2.5 mile track and race and get everything on it. And 20 years ago, the technology wasn't there to show everything happening, where you were just kind of following Schumacher and whoever it may be up at the front. And now you're getting literally able to see almost everything, or at least a replay of something happening almost at all times.
Aren't they bringing in helmet cams for all drivers starting next year?
Yes.
Yeah, 2023.
It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, I certainly think production, is arguably the most important part of a race. I mean, obviously, you want the quality of the vehicles to be such that the racing itself is entertaining, and then the job of the producers, like here in the States, ESPN, is to show what we want to see, right? If Max or Lewis or Charles has a 45-second lead, there's a reason they're not on the screen for quite some time, right? They're just kind of out doing their thing. Now, maybe there's a moment or two where they have to overtake a back marker or they have an issue in the pits, but they want to show the action that we're looking for, right? There may be a battle for 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th that is going down to the wire that they're gonna stick around and show. But yeah, the data is interesting. I know, Matt, you shared in our group thread that we have sort of the deviation between tracks. I know you mentioned Hungary, but Hungary had 48 more overtakes, whereas France had 28 less overtakes. So it's just the deviation's curious to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's some tracks that obviously increase and decrease, and that's where that average is. I mean, yeah, France was down. What was that? 28. I mean, why was that? It may be the regulations help on some tracks and not as well, not on the others. Maybe it hurts on some. Imola was a down 20, but it was also wet there, right? So you would think that would obviously hinder the ability to do that. Monaco was up 12, but also last year it had 0. It's just a difference in range, and so really it's just that average. I don't know why that is. Why some it helped drastically and some it didn't help at all. And it was this huge difference, right? Where the median of, instead of just the average, the median of overtakes was 1+1. So that just shows how big of a top and the bottom there were.
Yeah, and I know I mentioned, I mean, it's early. We're 13 races in, and Austin or Cole, you may know just from a historical perspective better than I do. But it's conceivable to think that over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, that they'll all sort of go in a similar direction. They'll kind of figure out what body type or what wing or whatever works best. There'll be some differences, obviously, from car to car, but do you think that they'll sort of all kind of shift in a certain direction, and then ultimately it'll come down to, okay, all cars look and feel the same. Now you've got power units that are different. You've got the driver that are different. And then it comes down to who's better on track.
I think you'll have kind of that difference of the engine providers, and they will have generally the same body styles because they all have the same thing sitting behind the driver. Matt, just to rewind really quickly, the interesting thing about the overtakes and whatnot is if you look at some of the races over the last 2 years, we mentioned kind of before we started recording today, Hungary. Max started 10th, he won. Lewis started 7th, he got 2nd. See, there's 16 overtakes, 15 overtakes there. If you look at Brazil last year, Lewis started 15th or whatever, won the race. Max in Russia the year, last year as well, started 20th, finished 19th. So you might get some of those where, one, it's raining, and two, you just have a car that's dominant starting out of position that's able to bully the midfield. So that might be interesting. But no, I think you will start seeing probably 2 or 3 like larger I guess like themes or generalizations of the vehicles, where this year you have 9 or 10 unique interpretations of the rules based on what you can and can't do. I think you'll start narrowing it down to 2 or 3 different body types, and what they're doing from there really depends on what's underneath the vehicle, like the brake components, the different things to help heat up the vehicle, tires, brakes, yada, yada.
And we've got a few more trivia questions for a little bit later in the podcast, but I think this is relevant to see if you guys can get this right based on overtakes and the new regulations. Who has the most overtakes so far in 2022? Seb is second with 38 overtakes.
And he didn't even start the first race.
Yep. I mean, when you start further back, you have more opportunity to overtake. So that could be a little hint. If you start P1 and you finish P1, you're not going to take any overtakes.
Lance Strolovich.
Lance Strolovich with
Wow.
52. Most overtakes by drivers in 2022 so far. Lance Stroll, 52. Sebastian Vettel, 38. Alex Albon, 35. George Russell, 34. Esteban Ocon, 31. Lewis Hamilton, 28. That's your top six most overtakes for the season so far.
So
I
I'm
think
going to
24
go with
of the George overtakes are from Ferrari.
Could be.
Just retiring, like just pulling off on the side of the road. That's an overtake.
Yeah, it's like all the other teams basically get like +1 per race when Ferrari messes up, right?
I'd love to see what Lance's his number of how many times he was overtaken. Like, is it 74? Like, is he like a negative 22 on the overtakes? What is your net number on how many times on your overtakes?
And real fast, I am so looking forward to Fernando Alonso next year dealing with Lance Strolovich. He will not put up with any of Lance's nonsense that he usually tries to pull. So I'm fired up to see what happens with those guys next year.
Yeah, that'll be great. I mean, I think just to put a bow on sort of the regulation discussion, I believe I mentioned this earlier. The thing that I have found most fascinating, and Austin, you mentioned this, that there's been sort of 9 or 10 different interpretations. And so we're all seeing very unique ways of trying to tackle the problem, and everyone's trying to figure out. So I actually love that part. I love that there's 9 or 10 different vehicles all on the track at the same time, using the resources to try to find, a half a second or a tenth of a second here and there. So that part's been exciting, and we're early, so hopefully they continue to get better. And I think, Matt, you've got something.
Yeah, with the new regulations and kind of this change, and with the cost cap and everything, drivers aren't a part of that cost cap, but for a team's P&L statement, they're obviously in there where they can only spend so much. That's why there's such a huge discrepancy. For y'all, if you had a team in this kind of era, would you go like 50-50 to driver, R&D, engineer, or what would you want to spend your money on? What do you think is more important for you to spend your money on to be successful in these new regulations? Is it the driver? Is it the car? Is it your engineer? Is it your team principal? Whatever it may be.
I think that's sort of the, what's the word? It's what F1's trying to figure out, and we've had the debate, and I know there's people who would love to debate, is Lewis the best driver or was he in the best car? And the problem with that is that we don't really know, because Mercedes was so dominant for so long. We all want to see, or at least I would want to see, all 20 drivers in the exact same car and try to figure out who's the best. Now, it seems like Formula One isn't set up for that. They're trying to put enough guardrails in place so the cars are pretty close. They're not fully standardized, but they're a lot closer. Yeah, that's what we'd all love to see. We'd all love to see them in the exact same machine and just see who's the best.
I do think the engineering standpoint is very fun. Seeing who can put that together better. I do think there should be guardrails like they're putting in place, and it's not just a free-for-all. But that difference between F1 and NASCAR and the engineers matter, them mattering more than, a different motorsport, I think is very cool to see. I think it's kind of cool to have those people impact Saturday and Sunday more than just a guy in the seat. That's the fun part to me, figuring it out, the wind tunnels and the R&D time and what you're putting into it and all that. It's I'd love to be able to just tour somebody for 48 hours and while they figure that out in the off season.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes F1 so fascinating, is that you have car performance. How good is the vehicle? Plus driver talent, plus engineering, plus strategy, which we've seen how that can impact a race. So it's not just pure, maybe right now Max is it doesn't matter what car you put him in, he's the most talented, fastest driver right now. But there's definitely a healthy combination. It's definitely a full team effort. Just because he's fast doesn't mean he's going to win. There's a whole bunch of other people behind him trying to get him there and put him up for an opportunity to win. So any last comments on the regulations before I know, Matt, you've got a couple other trivia questions for us? All right, all good. So Matt, hit us with your trivia questions. What do you got?
All right, so the first is not a trivia question. It's just trivia knowledge for those who care. 8 of the 20 drivers have been shirtless on social media. So for those who care about that, check out their Instagrams, their Twitters, their TikToks. Hoping to get closer to 20 over these next couple of weeks. Still waiting for a Seb shirtless photo. Fingers crossed on that one. But to the actual trivia questions, out of 3 young drivers, 2 of them Frenchmen, 1 of them a British, Landy, Esteban, and Pedro Gaseoso, who has more career points?
Between Lando, Ocon, and Pierre?
Bonus points if you can put them in order.
I'm going to go Ocon, Landy, Pierre.
Anybody else want to take a stab?
Yeah, that was actually going to be my guess. I would say Ocon is probably first, but I'll mix it up and I'll say Pierre is second and Lando is third.
And I'll put Pierre first. I'll put Lando second and Ocon third.
So Landy is first. He has like 382 or something career points. And then Esteban has 330 and Gasly at 325. So I thought that was interesting, especially the Esteban and Pierre numbers being that close. And they both have, I think Esteban just had his 100th Grand Prix 3 or 4 races ago. All right. And I'll go ahead. All these questions are current. The answers are current F1 drivers, so we're not going to just have to say random driver. So the next one is, who is the youngest driver to ever start on the front row in an F1 race? In the history of F1, the youngest driver to start on the front row.
Max?
He's second.
I would
by
say
about
Seb.
25 days. Not Seb.
No Seb.
So
Stan, you
Max
got an
was
answer
the
for us?
youngest driver ever. Seb was the youngest world champion ever. The youngest person to start on the Max didn't start on the front row until he was like 4th year. He didn't qualify well early.
He was second. He was 25 days older than this person.
I would say Charles.
Lance Strolovich, Italy, 2017.
He started on the front row?
He qualified 4th, but Max and Daniel Ricciardo both took new power engines, and so they took 10 place grid penalties, which bumped Lance up to second.
And what was the age? Like 21? 20?
18 years, 10 months, and 5 days old. Max was 18 years, 10 months, and 29 days old for second place.
That's a deep trivia question, removing 2 of the drivers.
Hey,
from the
he still started. Still started.
Touche.
Lance.
Last
one, third one. What current driver finished highest in their first Grand Prix?
Oof. Lewis.
He would be second place. He finished third in his first one.
Could somebody have won their first ever race, or they got a P2?
There's only like 3 people that have won their first ever race, and it was like the first, second, and third ever have F1 races. So I will say it is a P2.
Colston, we got to give your guesses.
I'll say Fernando.
Nope. I don't know what place he's in. I don't know where he finished his first one.
I'm just going to
Cole, you got a name?
I'm going to keep going Seb all night long. I'm just going to say Seb on everything that I got.
Kevin Magnussen. Finished
K-Mag.
second.
Really?
But I'll give it to Jordan. He called me out on the last one. Daniel Ricciardo finished second, and then he got DQ'd for a fuel issue. So that moved him to second. So he technically
Does
finished
2017?
third. Australia 2014.
2014.
It's also another trivia
Poor
to
Danny
the
Rick in
trivia.
Australia.
It's also Magnussen's only podium ever. So
He's
he got
only had
his
one
first
podium?
race,
Yeah,
first podium, only podium, and he's been here for 8 years. That's a good one.
That's a pretty incredible
Right.
stat, actually.
Yeah, that's
one race, one podium, only podium, and he's probably 185, 200 Grand Prix.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
So he's on a 199 race drought. So he's due second half of the year. Little teaser for next week when we make some predictions. We might have to get K-Mag back on the podium.
Yeah, 133 Grand Prix, one podium. So he was 1 for 1, and now he's 0 for 132.
What team was that with originally? Was he Renault? Who did he originally drive for?
I'm not sure, but I can find that out for you real quick.
I'm now curious of who. If he's only had one podium ever.
McLaren.
McLaren. All right.
I like it. Thanks, Matt. Those were good. So before we wrap up, we do have 2 listener questions. So appreciate those who have been tuning in and submitting your questions. Feel free to connect with us on social media. We are at the Slipstream F1 Pod on Instagram and at Slipstream F1 Pod on Twitter. Please give us a follow and submit your questions. So our first question comes from James in Idaho. Are they going to have to close the pedestrian bridges over the Las Vegas Strip next year when they race?
I hope not, but probably.
Someone throws something on the track.
I think they'll build it up a little bit higher, but I really hope not. I really hope that we can stand on a bridge and have those things come under us. But I cannot imagine how they let that happen.
They'd have to put like some kind of plexiglass, something that couldn't be broken or have stuff thrown through.
So I think they're going to seal that in to the track like proper, because when I was in Miami, you have all of the pedestrian bridges to walk over the track to get to like the different parts and cut turns off and not have to walk around. But there's plywood on all of the bridges, so you can't see through. There's also security guards on the up and the downstairs to tell you, move, you're stopping traffic.
So you can't like you can take a drill and like poke eye holes in it to be able to see from the top.
Yeah, so that sounds like a lean no. Probably not going to be able to watch it, but man, how cool would that be? I mean, if you've ever been to Vegas, they just have the big glass windows, along all the crosswalks. If you could just sit there and watch them blazing down the strip at night in Vegas.
They have also changed the Vegas weekend. It was originally going to be Thanksgiving weekend next year. It's going to be the weekend before. I want to say it's November 18th. And they're still not accepting reservations, in case you were wondering.
I was about to say, did you call Treasure Island since the date had changed?
I did. Sure did.
You should let them know that my birthday's right around then too. Maybe that'll get them moving in our direction, but probably not. Always worth a shot. All right, so question 2 comes to us from Dave in Virginia Beach. Which of these 2 cars would have the faster lap time? A Formula 1 car with NASCAR tires or a NASCAR with F1 tires? How big are NASCAR tires? They're probably, twice as big as an F1 tire, putting those bad boys on an F1 car?
That's an interesting question from Dave. I'm gonna say an Indy car or a F1 car with NASCAR tires. I don't know why. I don't know why that makes any sense. I don't know if they fit, but that sounds good to me.
NASCAR tires look to be 15 inches in diameter and 10 inches wide.
Wheel,
yeah. I'm going with the if we're going on the F1 track, I can't imagine that clunky, heavy piece of machinery trying to get around like Baku at 160 miles an hour. Like, can you imagine an F1 car going through Castle? Like, can it even fit through there and make that like?
You mean
funky...
a NASCAR?
NASCAR, yeah. Like, can a NASCAR car even fit through there? It's got to be an F1 car. That's my guess.
Cole, you'd probably know this with your show car experience. Does a NASCAR have power steering? You'd have to turn that thing like you're driving a bus to get it through Castle, I would think, right?
No, yeah, you definitely. There's no power steering in that thing. Walmart parking lots, you can rip a bunch of donuts in those old show cars and get a real feel for what the power that they have. But no power steering. But I would come back to it. What if we put an F1 car with NASCAR tires on a Bristol track? I feel like we got a different ballgame now. We're not no road course. Let's just go whatever the Bank Oval is in Bristol.
So there's a really amazing video on YouTube that shows the difference of vehicle performance from F3, F2, F1, Formula E, NASCAR, Indy, MotoGP, everything. Formula One's like 15% faster than all of those other vehicles. So I don't think you're beating a Formula One car, even if it has to drive on wet tires. Like, it's kind of like what the NASCAR tire would be. I also don't think a NASCAR car could heat up the tire for a Formula One car to be 100 Celsius to activate the traction. Also, another great video on YouTube where there was someone who put Formula One cars on a street regulated vehicle, had the tire blankets, tried to do some track laps, and he could not. He was slower on the F1 tires because he could not get them to temperature compared to standard normal road or racing tires.
I love that. I was going to go a little bit of a different direction. I definitely agree. I think the F1 car would win, but I'd like to see a NASCAR with last year's 13-inch F1 tires on it. Big old boxy NASCAR with teeny tiny tires on it. I just want to see it. I think that'd be hilarious.
And did y'all see the interview with Max? He was on it. It may have been a Barstool podcast, but they asked him like about could he go in and drive like NASCAR and whatever, and he gave the most politically correct answer. He was like, I do drive NASCAR in my simulator, and it does take a little while to get used to, and this and that, and it was just so like you could just see in his eyes that he was like that. It's just I'm just doing this the whole time. Like it was just very very PC answer by Max, and it it's the F1 car, and I think even Max knows that. I think the F1 drivers would be bored in a NASCAR.
Well, especially on a track like Daytona, when I think the pedal is down 100% of the time.
Y'all will have to keep your eyes open because August 21st, Kimi Räikkönen will be running NASCAR Watkins Glen. He did testing a few days ago, so he has made the jump before, but it will be interesting to see Kimi behind the wheel again.
Street track too, so yeah, that'd be we'll definitely have to check that out on the 21st. Before we close out, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just gonna say fighting seems more allowed in NASCAR these days, so maybe Kimi gets into a little battle off the track as well. His attitude and nastiness is a lot of fun.
I mean, those seem like tanks compared to an open wheel, monocoque single seater, right?
Rubbin's racing, baby. We all know that. So before we leave, Cole, anything on the driver carousel we need to know about? I feel like it's been a lot quieter in the last week or so, but
yeah, crickets. There's really nothing happening. We all still are going to assume Oscar ends up in McLaren. Danny Rick, we assume, is out until he signs something, so then McLaren can announce. But nothing's happening. We're all at a standstill. Everyone's still in shock that Fernando has left. So a couple weeks, hopefully we find out a lot more of what's getting ready to come up next season.
And didn't they confirm that Gasly can't? We were discussing last week. We were really hoping Gasly to the Alpine, and we're now Helmut said that, or however you pronounce his last name, can't happen.
I'm not going to say that we're confirming it because I feel like you never know. But it sounds like we read that there was an exit clause if there was a team who was making him an offer who was higher in the standings than Red Bull AlphaTauri, which Alpine would have checked all those boxes. And then Helmut Marko came out and said that was not accurate. So we have no idea. I'm still going to hope and pray that he ends up there because he deserves a better car than that AlphaTauri.
Yeah, I agree. So we'll definitely be on the lookout. I know we've got 2 more weeks till we return to Formula One racing in Belgium. So yeah, that wraps up another episode of the Slipstream podcast. Be sure to tune in next week as we look forward to the rest of 2022 and make some predictions on what we think will happen in the second half of the year. So as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.